In 1958, a scientific survey team landing on the south side of Clipperton Island, a jagged, desolate ring of coral in the eastern Pacific, recovered a 1917 Mexican silver peso. It was found wedged into a hairline fracture in the volcanic rock, the island's only elevation. The coin was heavily pitted, its surface eroded by 40 years of concentrated bird guano and the relentless abrasive action of salt spray. It was a heavy, useless symbol of a central government that had effectively ceased to exist for the people who held it. To the soldiers on the island, it was no longer currency. It was merely a piece of cold metal that had outlasted their loyalty. The tragedy of Clipperton Island was not a failure of character, but a systemic collapse of geopolitical logistics. It was the broken chain of 1914. The colony existed as a proxy presence, a handful of human beings placed on a 2-square-mile atoll to maintain a lighthouse and assert Mexican sovereignty against the French and the Americans. The system relied entirely on a rhythmic pulse, a resupply ship every 2 months. But when the Mexican Civil War descended into total chaos, the pulse stopped. The why of the disaster was a catastrophic oversight of hubris, the assumption that a nation can maintain a remote, non-productive outpost without a functioning navy. In Mexico City, the officials responsible for the garrison were either executed, exiled, or simply too preoccupied with their own survival to remember 100 people on a rock 800 miles offshore. The garrison was not defeated, it was forgotten. The machine of the Clipperton colony was calibrated for order, not autonomy. From at its head was Captain Ramon Arnaud, a man of rigid military pedigree who viewed the island not as a landscape, but as a post. He brought with him a garrison of 13 soldiers, their wives, their children, and a handful of labourers, approximately 100 people in total. Their psychological anchor was the chain of command. Arnaud's survival style was defined by a dogmatic adherence to Mexican military protocol. He believed that as long as the flag was raised and the lighthouse was lit, the state remained a tethered reality. Their technical inventory was an exercise in misplaced optimism. They arrived with crates of salt pork, dried beans, and flour, supplies designed to bridge the gaps between the 2-month arrivals of the USS Cleveland or Mexican steamers. They did not bring seeds for a sustainable crop, nor did they have the tools to desalinize the stagnant, brackish water of the central lagoon. Their most vital biological asset was a cluster of exactly 11 coconut trees planted by a previous occupant. In the Clipperton system, these trees were not merely flora, they were the only local source of vitamin C. The mission was a high-stakes game of sovereignty by proxy. Clipperton is a ring of coral, a geological null space that is nearly impossible to navigate. Its only value was its position. To the Mexican government, the garrison was a human flag. To the soldiers, the island was a temporary inconvenience. They lived in a state of dependency stasis, waiting for the mechanical pulse of the outside world to sustain them. They failed to realize that they were residing on a guano atoll, a place where the soil is so saturated with phosphate and bird waste that nothing of nutritional value to a human can grow without intervention. They were waiting for a ship in a world that had forgotten how to sail to them. The routine of the Clipperton colony fractured on February 28, 1914. This was the date the resupply ship was scheduled to crest the horizon. It never appeared. In Mexico, the government of Victoriano Huerta was collapsing under the weight of the revolution, and the bureaucratic memory of the 100 people on the atoll was erased by the smoke of a burning capital. The chain of causality tightened when the USS Cleveland made a final, unscheduled stop in early 1914. The American captain, sensing the impending geopolitical vacuum, offered to evacuate the entire garrison. Here, the system encountered its moral pivot. Captain Ramon Arnaud, anchored by a lethal sense of duty and a belief that the system would eventually correct itself, refused the evacuation. He chose the flag over the biological reality of his people. As the Cleveland sailed away, the colony entered its terminal phase. The transition from a resupply economy to an isolate economy was instantaneous and brutal. The stockpiled flour turned to a grey, weevil-infested dust. the salt pork became a vector for botulism. The catastrophic failure was finalized by the biological gatekeeper, the coconut trees. Arnaud, maintaining military order, rationed the trees. He mandated that the coconuts, the island's only defense against systemic decay, be reserved for the women and children. For the soldiers, the friendly Pacific became a sterile desert. They were forced to subsist on the meat of the booby birds and the eggs they found in the guano. While calorically sufficient, this diet was a chemical trap. The human body cannot synthesize vitamin C. Without it, the Garrison's collective clock began to count down to a state of molecular disintegration. The mechanics of survival on Clipperton devolved into a desperate war against nutrient scarcity. With the flour exhausted, the Garrison's inventory was reduced to the atoll's only abundant resource, the masked booby and the sooty tern. The biological reality of seabird survival is a punishing trade-off. While bird meat is high in protein, the lack of carbohydrates forces the liver into gluconeogenesis, the process of converting protein into glucose. This is metabolically expensive and places a massive strain on the kidneys. Furthermore, the water system was a failure. The central lagoon was a brackish soup of sulfur and salt. The survivors were forced to rely on lentic harvesting, using rusted tins and canvas scraps to catch the sudden, violent Pacific squalls. In the heat of the equatorial sun, evaporation rates exceeded 5 millimeters per hour. If it did not rain for 48 hours, the colony began to exhibit the first signs of hyponatremia, elevated blood sodium that leads to neurological tremors. As the months bled into years, the world of the survivors narrowed to the tactile grit of coral. Clipperton is not a lush island. It is a razor-sharp ring of calcium carbonate. Every movement was a risk. A small scrape from the coral would not heal in the humid, bacteria-rich air, turning into a tropical ulcer within days. The sensory landscape was dominated by the overwhelming, ammonia-heavy stench of 10,000 nesting birds. This was not a smell that faded, it was a physical weight that coated the throat and lungs. The soundscape was stripped of human artifice, reduced to the constant, rhythmic crush hiss of the Pacific surf against the reef and the incessant, primitive shrieking of the birds. The world became a white noise machine that eroded the capacity for complex thought. By 1915, the biological tax was due. Without the coconuts, the soldiers entered the terminal stages of ascorbic acid depletion. Vitamin C is the molecular glue of the human body. It is required for collagen synthesis. At the 90-day mark of zero intake, the glue begins to fail. As the forensic reality of scurvy is visceral. Old wounds, some decades old, began to spontaneously reopen as the scar tissue lost its structural integrity. Gums became necrotic, turning a bruised purple and detaching from the jaw. The clinical transition was most evident in the legs. The capillaries burst under the weight of the body's own blood, creating woody edema, limbs so swollen and hard they felt like timber. At this threshold, the systemic failure of the body was complete. The men were no longer soldiers. They were disintegrating biological systems, unable to walk, unable to chew, and eventually unable to breathe, as the heart muscle itself began to soften. By early 1917, the hierarchy of the Mexican army had dissolved into a ghost state. Logic, which requires a glucose-rich and oxygenated brain, it had been replaced by the erosion of the frontier. When Captain Ramon Arnaud looked out at the horizon, he no longer saw a strategic outpost, he saw a cage. In a moment of metabolic delirium, Arnaud spotted a vessel on the horizon. Or perhaps he only spotted the hope of one. In an act that defied every maritime safety protocol, he ordered the remaining healthy men into a small, rotted rowboat. This was the Pattern Interrupter. The officers, driven by a sudden, frantic need to bridge the logistical gap, rowed directly into the crushing Pacific surf. The boat was pulverized by the reef within minutes. The ocean, acting as a sentient judge, claimed the last of the human system's leadership. Arnaud and his men were swallowed, leaving behind a power vacuum on a ring of coral occupied only by 15 women, children, and one man, the lighthouse keeper, Victoriano Alvarez. With the officers dead, the island's social architecture didn't just collapse, it inverted. Victoriano Alvarez, a man previously at the bottom of the military caste, declared himself the King of Clipperton. He did not rule by decree, but by the monopoly of violence. The lighthouse, once a beacon for international shipping, became a watchtower for a localized tyrant. Alvarez gathered the remaining firearms and retreated to the Rock, forcing the women and children into a state of feudal sexual slavery. He controlled the coconuts, he controlled the water, he controlled the life and death of every biological unit left on the atoll. The geography had birthed a secondary antagonist, a human predator who was the product of 3 years of isolation and untreated neurosyphilis. The struggle was no longer against the birds or the scurvy, but against the predatory whim of a man who realized that in an administrative void, there is no such thing as a crime. On July 18, 1917, the USS Yorktown, a gunboat on routine patrol for German commerce raiders, steamed toward the low, white line of the Clipperton Reef. The American sailors did not encounter a garrison. They encountered a scene of systemic wreckage. The extraction was recorded in the ship's log with the clinical detachment of a forensic after-action report, noting the transition from a sovereign outpost to a biological graveyard. As the landing party breached the surf, they witnessed the final act of the island's internal war. Only minutes before the Americans reached the shore, the women of the colony, led by Tirza Rendon, had reached their metabolic and psychological limit. Using a hammer and a rusted knife, they had executed the self-appointed king, Victoriano Alvarez. The tyrant was found face down in the sand, his throne of bird guano and stolen coconuts finally dismantled. The survivors were a collection of metabolic ghosts. As the sailors herded Tirza Rendon, Alicia Arno, and their children onto the Yorktown, they described a state of catatonic resilience. Their skin was translucent from a chronic lack of lipids, and their eyes were fixed in the 1,000-yard stare of those who have lived at the absolute edge of the Umwelt. They carried nothing but the scorched clothes on their backs and a few tattered relics of their former lives. The final count of the Clipperton expedition remains one of the most lopsided ratios in the history of isolated survival. When we look at the cold math of this abandonment, the numbers speak with a heavy, rhythmic finality. In 1914, the colony began with approximately 100 individuals, soldiers, labourers, and their families. Over the 3 years that followed, the Pacific, the scurvy, and the violence claimed 89 of them. When the Yorktown finally pulled away from the reef, only 11 survivors remained on its deck, 3 women and 8 children. The arithmetic is brutal. It represents a 90% attrition rate. In the surgical reality of the atoll, the human system had been almost entirely deleted. Not a single adult male survived the 3-year abandonment. The state had sent a garrison to hold a rock, and in the end, the rock held nothing but their names in a forgotten ledger. Clipperton Island today is a yellow zone, a place so saturated with the chemical signatures of death and defecation that it remains largely uninhabitable. It is a restricted French overseas territory, visited only by occasional scientific teams who must wear protective gear to navigate the ammonia-heavy air and the millions of aggressive land crabs that now dominate the ecosystem. These crabs act as the island's janitors, recycling the calcium of the reef and the remains of anything that fails to leave. The lighthouse still stands, a rusted iron skeleton perched upon the rock. It serves no one. It is a monument to a sovereignty that was never truly exercised, a hollow signal sent into a void that stopped listening decades ago. The lesson of the machine is found in the lethal intersection of duty and logistics. Captain Arno's refusal to leave was a triumph of the human spirit, but a catastrophic failure of the human organism. He believed the system, the Mexican state, was an immutable, immortal force. In reality, it was merely a fragile network of papers, promises, and supply lines that could be severed by a single revolution. When the logistics failed, the duty became a suicide pact. The biology of the men could not be sustained by the ideology of the flag. Clipperton remains a forensic reminder that in the absence of a resupply ship, the only laws that matter are the laws of thermodynamics, the scarcity of vitamin C, and the desperate, crushing weight of the biological clock. The silence of the atoll today is the sound of a system that worked until it didn't. It is the sound of 100 lives weighed against a 2 square mile patch of guano, where the math simply didn't add up. The island does not remember the names of the soldiers or the rank of the captain. It only remembers the hunger. The flag flew until there was no one left who remembered what the colours meant. If this clinical dissection of history's most harrowing failures has resonated with you, consider becoming a permanent part of our collective inquiry. We don't just tell stories, we perform autopsies on the events that define the limits of human endurance and the fragility of our social structures. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. By supporting this series, you ensure that the administrative voids of history are illuminated and that the voices silenced by the machine are finally heard. Our next investigation will descend into the ice to track the final, desperate steps of the Franklin expedition.